Oftentimes on this podcast, we've dwelled on the idea that the world as we knew it is not stable, that the order that we grew up in is crumbling. And this is, in many ways, very obviously true domestically. I also think it's true in terms of foreign policy. And it's clear that today, far more than I think at any time in my life, there are many possible futures for the world order. And so, to understand those possible futures and perhaps also where we came from and how we got here, I thought I would have on Joe Stieb, an assistant professor at UNC Chapel Hill and a historian of American foreign policy. Yeah, Joe, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Sam. It's my pleasure.
All right, so I guess to start us off with, I want to start my story with the fall of the Soviet Union,
Mm.
right? And the Cold War has its own dynamics. Very interesting dynamics, but let's set those aside for the moment. The Soviet Union has kind of imploded very unexpectedly from the American perspective. George H.W. Bush is sitting in the White House. What's the world as he sees it?
So the Bush administration is interesting because I think if you want to get at their approach to the post-Cold War world, you have to look at how they changed their perspective when he took office. So in 1989, the Bush administration, or the first Bush administration, comes into office. And it's a little more skeptical of the Reagan administration of this idea that we're going to resolve the Cold War. So right off the bat, there's a little bit of a desire to slow down the rapprochement with the Soviet Union that was going on in Reagan's second term, right? But then events kind of take over. You get the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of all these Eastern Bloc regimes, the Tiananmen Square massacre, and it opens up all these questions, right? It opens up the sense of a transforming international system, right, in which our great power or superpower rival, well, first becomes almost a friend, right, a partner in some ways, like in the Gulf War, and then second disappears, right? And so you got these folks, this administration, which had a kind of a realist, conservative bent, right, both in terms of its style and its ideology and its view of the world, dealing with one of the most transformative periods, in the 20th century geopolitically. So what they mostly try to do, I think, is to lock in certain changes to how the international system will operate. The best example of this is, I think, the Persian Gulf War itself. All right, so the Bush administration's thinking in the Persian Gulf War is it's not just a conflict for kicking the Iraqis out of Kuwait, right, and preventing Saddam from becoming a regional hegemon, which is a very realist understanding of the Gulf War. It's also a precedent-setting opportunity, right? So we can now cooperate with the Soviet Union. We can get a lot of Arab nations on our side. We can reinforce this norm of sovereignty, but also the norm of collective action, right? So the norm that the UN actually can be a place for the resolution of disputes. The UN can actually vote in favor of the use of force, right, which it hadn't really done since the Korean War, at least in a conflict the United States had been involved with. So you had this interesting clash sort of between the Bush administration's very conservative temperament and its seizing of these opportunities. And if we want, we can evaluate how well they did this, or some of the ways they fell short, right? But I can leave that comment there.
I mean, no, I think that's an interesting question. How
Sure.
well
Yeah.
did they do it?
Well, I think they did it quite well. I think it's probably the most successful foreign policy presidency of the 20th century, with the exception of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Um,
Hard man to
and
measure up there.
sorry,
Hard man to measure up
hard
there.
hard to measure up. Eisenhower would be up there, but I think George H.W. Bush is really high up there. So they pursued these. I think they kind of broke out of their realist temperament and realized that this was an opportunity for real transformation of our relationships around the world and for the solidifying of these institutions, right? I think they kind of anticipated that, well, later other countries will emerge. China will obviously rise, right, from its relatively lowly position in the 1980s, right? But this is an amorphous protean moment. And so, they pursued German reunification much more aggressively than anyone thought possible. And it was a wild success. They were initially cautious about NATO expansion, right? Made the loose promise to the Soviet Union that they wouldn't expand it, right? But they certainly strengthened NATO over the course of
Hmm.
their presidency. Uh, you know, they use kind of the momentum of the Persian Gulf War, right, to push for the Madrid conference, which sets up the Oslo conference, right, and probably gets us closer to an Israeli-Palestinian peace than we've ever gotten, right, certainly than we are right now. And so, they used all these opportunities, but one of the main contradictions was, they used the language of human rights in justifying let's say the Gulf War, for example, and kind of talking about Bush's New World Order, which is a phrase he only used a few times, and they, his administration even said this doesn't really mean anything. We just kind of like the sound of it, but it created new expectations. So anyway, they used the language of human rights, but didn't put a lot of human rights oomph behind their policies. So the best example of this was Tiananmen Square, right? The Bush administration is trying to continue to normalize relations with China, to build trade relationships, right, and eventually get most favored nation status for China so we can trade more actively with them. And when Tiananmen Square comes along, you kind of have to choose between, do we halt that process of economic normalization for human rights reasons, democracy reasons, or do we kind of tone down the criticism, right, and let China deal with it internally? And the Bush administration sided for the latter. And so I think a lot of, and there's reasonable reasons for them to have done that, right? But that was kind of the conflict between their use of this New World Order language, human rights language on one hand, but a pretty hard-nosed realist approach to the world on the other hand. But my favorite thing about the Bush administration's foreign policy is that they had a realist orientation, but understood that institutions were important and that institutions actually strengthened American power. And I think that's something that later presidents were lacking an understanding of.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, right? That, like you say, they were on this moment when they were the only superpower left standing,
Yeah, yeah.
and they were just, holy shit, we can just do all kinds of stuff. We have this ability to like really reset the rules, and they used that opportunity in some ways to strengthen institutions. And like you say, there's that tension about like how much were they really committed to these ideas of values versus just like a realist understanding of American interest. So, of course, George H.W. only gets one term,
Yep.
and is succeeded by Clinton. Do you think Clinton continues on with this kind of foreign policy stance?
I think he basically does. I think that Clinton and Bush are very similar in their foreign policy approaches. Probably the biggest difference is that Clinton is a major advocate of globalization. And so Clinton is even more aggressive about creating, of course, there's NAFTA, right? But he's pursuing WTO membership for China. He intervenes in Mexico in the mid 1990s, intervenes in the Southeast Asian banking crisis. Clinton, I think, much more sees economic power as the most, well, not necessarily the most important. I think he sees the value of economic power more so than his predecessor did.
I mean, it's the famously he had that phrase on his desk, right? It's the economy, stupid.
It's the
Um,
economy stupid, and then he also he had a great line that kind of from the, well, it wasn't a great line because it doesn't look so good in hindsight, but he gave a speech at I think the end of his presidency where he basically said something you could hear from the mouth of Mark Zuckerberg, which is like information sharing, connecting people. It's going to have positive results on the world, right? And that was like the underlying assumption of this era of optimistic globalization, right? Which is if you connect people economically, you connect people digitally, you just kind of shrink the world, right? To use Thomas Friedman's phrase, then you get a more harmonious world. You kind of isolate these countries like North Korea and Iran, right? What they called originally called the backlash states. They become known as rogue states. So for Clinton, I think it's an economic lens on the world, but it's still very institutionally focused, right? It's how do we build trade deals? How do we create rules? And the United States acts as sort of the manager of this
mhm.
process. Yeah.
And how does the intervention in Kosovo fit into that frame?
So another great question. So, uh, let me take that back to the early 90s in the Bush administration. So the Bush administration is very hesitant about, this is HW, very hesitant about getting involved in the Yugoslav civil war. And James Baker, the Secretary of State, famously says, we don't have a dog in that fight. Right? You've probably heard that phrase before. It's just this ethnic conflict that is confusing to Americans. It's confusing to everyone pretty much. And why should we expend our power and prestige to try to deal with this conflict? Of course, the conflict only gets worse and it gets handed off to Clinton. I think Clinton was less comfortable with the use of force on sort of an interstate basis, right? The sort of the classic great power basis, although he does do some things like that, like in the Taiwan Straits crisis. Clinton kind of is as part of this pro-internationalist, pro-globalization grand strategy, I think sees key U.S. responsibility as intervening in these hotspots around the world to make sure they don't metastasize and grow. Right. So a lot of people argue that I think maybe people to my left, scholars argue that Clinton's interventions are very much about how do we spread markets to these regions. There's really not much evidence for that, right? Somalia is not a major market. Yugoslavia, not an economic powerhouse at the time. The same would go for Haiti, which he intervenes in the 90s, right? But it fits with Clinton's larger image of the U.S. as a manager of crises, whether they're economic or humanitarian style crises. So anyway, he comes very close to embracing this responsibility to protect kind of doctrine, and obviously ends up in 4 or 5 different humanitarian interventions.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, would you say that this is him taking seriously that commitment to human rights that George H.W. only kind of gestured at?
I think it is. And of course, he didn't do so in a, he still respected the limits of American power. So he kind of quite famously or infamously doesn't go into Rwanda in 1994, which probably was the worst humanitarian crisis of the decade, right? But there's a lot of practical reasons he doesn't do that. It's not clear what the United States can actually do in the situation or how it's going to deal with the aftermath. So short answer to that, yes. Yeah. Well, I'll add one more thing really quickly about Clinton. They had this thing, the book America Between the Wars by Derek Chollet is really good on this, and Jim Goldgeier, they were a really good book on this. And they had this thing in the National Security Council called the Kennan Sweepstakes. This is in like 1993, 1994. And the idea was, in the Cold War, we had this one word, containment, right? Containment embodied all of American grand strategy. It was passed down from party to party, administration to administration. And so Anthony Lake in the National Security Council held the Kennan Sweepstakes, which was challenging the national security staff to say, can you come up with like a word or a phrase that embodies what America should be doing in the world? And basically they all admitted they couldn't. There was no single word, right, that could unify American power when there wasn't the Soviet Union, the big bad bear there to orient you to everything. My view on that is it's actually better to not have a single word, right? We intervened all over the world in the Cold War, including a lot of covert operations, regime change operations, unnecessary wars, because we had that very unitary focus on the Soviet Union, and we treated them like a monolith at times. So anyway, always an interesting little side story about the Clinton administration, their struggle to come up with like a word, right, a bumper sticker.
No, I think
Yeah.
I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's something I'm going to come back to when we get
Sure.
to Obama. But for now, I want to ask about George W. Bush, right? And the sense, I think it's pretty obvious that he's a major departure from the
Mm-hmm.
kind of foreign policy pursued by his father and also by Clinton. Um, Obviously 9/11 is a big part of that, but I think you've written about how the foreign policy consensus of the 90s kind of broke down, and led to the a very different picture of the world that George W. operated under. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So the George W. team, personality wise, is different than the HW team, even though it's a lot of the same people, right? Like Dick Cheney is the Secretary of Defense, and then he's the Vice President. They have a lot of the same staffers. I think over the course of the 1990s, a lot of these people became more unilateralist in their approach to foreign policy, much more skeptical of institutions, and in some ways, more willing to use American force. So on the right, particularly in the 1990s, there's a lot of frustration that Clinton was frittering away American power in these peripheral conflicts, right? He's intervening in Somalia and Kosovo and in Haiti or wherever, but he's not intervening, at least not intervening strongly enough against Iran, China, North Korea, Iraq in particular, right, in the 1990s. And so this new team comes in and they share the first Bush administration's belief in the importance of military power, but they are far more unilateralist and they are skeptical of institutions. Right, so they immediately leave the Kyoto Climate Accords. Right, they immediately kind of signal that they're going to be more willing to use American force unilaterally across the world. This is all before September 11th. Right, and that September 11th becomes kind of a radicalizing moment, right, for their worldview that I think is fairly established. So I'll give like a phrase that I think really helps communicate this. Paul Wolfowitz and Robert Kagan, kind of these famous neocons in the 90s, and William Crystal as well, put together this volume, a book in I think 1997 called Present Dangers. And it was sort of a tour of the world. And it was like, here's the problems with Iraq, and here's the problems with Iran, and et cetera. Here's terrorism. But the intro essay is really interesting because what they argue is the real threat to international order is not any given country around the world. It's not China yet. It's not even the given force like terrorism, right? Or civil war or demographic change, climate change, whatever, right? They say that the real threat or that the real present danger is that the United States will step back from the world, right? Because the United States stepping back from the world means every single one of these problems becomes better. So this embrace of the U.S. as the fulcrum of the international order, very important to the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, right? But to be fair, also important to the Clinton administration. I think they saw the U.S. playing that role in different ways, right? But this idea of the fulcrum still holds.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to push back on that a little bit,
Sure. Yeah, of course.
it often seemed to me that, yeah, they believed America should be, the steward in charge of the world, but they just weren't interested in like what the traditional, like, how to put this, like, yeah, you say the fulcrum of a world order, but like the rest of the lever is these institutions of international law, of
Yeah.
international trade, the United Nations, all these things that like we created, post 45, and they just seem to regard those as like unnecessary impediments on American power, right? They seem incredibly cynical about the United
Mm-hmm.
Nations in particular. Um, and so I'm wondering, like, what vision of America in the world were they pursuing here?
The second Bush administration.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think their vision is contradictory before September 11th. There's different things moving in different directions. So like a key point, I think, for a lot of the people in the vice president's office and the secretary of defense's office was restoring American sovereignty, right? Oh, hey, it's a cat. It's my cat. that's Flo. You might see Harriet too. She might jump up
Yeah,
here.
no, she's gorgeous.
She's cute. uh, okay. So, a key aspect of conservative foreign policy thought is this idea of sovereignty, right? Going back to the League of Nations, they've often seen America signing treaties or America joining these institutions as infringements on American sovereignty. So the go-to example of this is Senator Jesse Helms from North Carolina, who always wanted the United States to basically cut off all funding to the United Nations, leave many of our treaties and institutions around the world. He actually talked a lot about human rights kind of as a cudgel. But he believed that all of these agreements, institutions, were just infringements on American sovereignty. Right? It's not true. None of these, if you sign up to a treaty and the Senate ratifies it, right, then it's not an imposition on American sovereignty. It's an agreement, right,
Hmm.
to change your behavior. But anyway, that's a key perspective on the right. And so Cheney, Rumsfeld, they really see international law, international institutions as something that's almost, it's just weird, something it's almost targeted to restrain the United States, right? So originally the Wilsonian, especially Rooseveltian international system was all about how do we legitimize the use of our power around the world, right? How do we give other countries a say in how we use that power? And how do we create rules that will reassure countries that we're not just going to use it willy-nilly in an irresponsible way? All right. So this is kind of a classic liberal internationalist IR theory, right? Is that these things actually enhance our power around the world by making it legitimate. That's not how the right tends to see it, right? The right tends to think these are constraints upon our power. This is the Lilliputians tying down Gulliver. And so right when they come into office, there's a desire to move away from these things, to distance the United States from this, system that we created ourselves, so that we can more directly and unconstrainedly deal with problems around the world. That's all
So
pre 9/11, I would say.
can I ask?
Yeah.
So do you think that this is just conservatives, reverting to the mean of conservative foreign
Mm.
policy, or are there things in the '90s and about the foreign policy of the '90s that made them kind of sour on international institutions?
Really great question. uh, there's not many examples of conservatives, including neoconservatives, being really enthusiastic about international institutions, international law. Um, they are often enthusiastic about alliances and alliance systems, right? So neoconservatives have always been very big on NATO, very big on the U.S., Japan, South Korea relationship, very big on the Israeli alliance, you know. But when it comes to, I think there's a dose of realism in neoconservatism that kind of says all these international institutions, you know, are really just a replacement. They're kind of a cover for American power. If America doesn't maintain its power and use its power, these institutions are pointless, right? So that's kind of why the neoconservatives argue that America gets to determine the exception to how, right? I mean, okay, Schmidt's so hot right now. Uh, America gets to determine the exception, right, to whatever international law or international institution, because if there's no America doing this stuff, right, then there's no international order to speak of. Um, so, it is hard to find. So, you asked about the 1990s. You know, it's hard to tell. I think, I always like to connect conservative thinking in the 1990s to the domestic culture war that's going on, the Pat Buchanan kind of culture war concept. They're very concerned about America's demographic changes in the 1990s, what they see as adverse cultural changes, like general more permissiveness in the culture. I think there's a point at which they start to see bold military action overseas as something that will kind of bounce back in a positive way on American society, right? Something that will be more unifying, that will defeat.
Restore the manly virtues.
There's that. I mean, Victor Davis Hanson, the historian, says that, right? So this is not me putting conservatives on the couch and psychoanalyzing them. This is stuff that they're saying. Right?
Okay, so so yeah, I mean, I think we have this picture. Bush comes into office, the neocons with him come into office. They're skeptical of these international institutions, and man, do they get the chance to put their theory into practice. Right? They take
Yeah.
us into Afghanistan, where we stay for another 20 years. They take us into Iraq in a war that I think is, we can debate about like what exactly the motivations for it were, but
Mm.
it's like largely a war of choice.
Yes.
Um, you know, basically fudge the data, manipulate the UN. Like there's a lot of stuff going on. And look, I mean, from my perspective, I think from the perspective of many people today, it looks like kind of a disaster.
Yep.
And I don't really know how much there is to say about that, so I just kind of want to. I mean, whatever. I'm sure there's a lot to say about it, but for the purposes of time, I'm going to kind of skip over that era
Yeah, sure.
and
That's
ask you about Obama,
yeah, sure.
right? And Obama comes into office, and how does he see the world? How is he trying to repair the damage that Bush has done? What's he trying to put forward as a new American foreign policy?
Good question. So the first premise or first caveat is it's always kind of hard to tell what Obama thinks about foreign policy because he inherits such a mess, right? He, like George Bush on 9/11, I granted, I would not want to be president on September 11th, 2001. But if there's ever a blank slate moment for American foreign policy, a chance to take things in dramatic new directions, that was it. Right? Obama doesn't get that opportunity. He inherits a financial crisis, which is number one priority that he has to solve. And he inherits, the Iraq war, which has been stabilized by that time, right? But it's still not quite a fully function. It's not a functioning, a well-functioning society at that point. And he inherits an Afghanistan situation that's only getting worse, right? Along with a bunch of other problems. So, a lot of Obama's foreign policy is putting out fires that have already been set. But I think the way he sees the world is the United States. Actually, let me give you a metaphor that what's her name, Anne Marie Slaughter uses. That's really great. She's an IR theorist and political scientist. She talks about the chessboard and the network. I think it is right. So the chessboard is the old school way of thinking about international relations. It's two sides. They're balancing against each other. They check each other. Right. But they're still kind of unified pieces. America is the queen, Russia is the other queen, Britain's the rook, right? Whatever metaphor you want to use. And that's how a lot of American foreign policy thinkers approach it, right? And then this idea of the network, right, is much more that international relations, or that the power of states in the international system is weakening in an age of globalization, right? They're less able to form coherent policies. There's the rise of all these different transnational actors that are really important. So, and then also transnational issues like climate change or migration. And so Obama wants to shift American foreign policy, I think, towards dealing more with those transnational issues, right? So the Paris Climate Accords is probably the best example of this. You need to create better relationships and reduce tensions with China and with Russia and all these other countries because there's no solving these larger problems without cooperation, right? Without kind of zooming or moving away from the chessboard, right, towards a more networked understanding of the world. So I think that's a big part of his view of the world. It's not necessarily that the United States has to solve every problem, but it has to be involved in the solution to every problem, if that distinction makes sense, right?
No, that distinction makes
Yeah.
sense. To get back to this earlier point about the Kennan sweepstakes,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
there are two phrases that I see most associated with Obama's foreign policy. And one of them is "don't do stupid shit,"
I'm just stupid.
and
Yep.
the other one is the rules-based international order.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that and how those ideas guided Obama's foreign policy.
Sure. So we'll start with don't do stupid shit. That one is totally a reaction to George W. Bush, right? We intervened in Iraq. It was unnecessary. It was a war choice, as you said. It shredded our credibility around the world. It led to unnecessary deaths, destabilized the whole region. So there's way more. Well, let me rephrase that. The Obama administration comes in with an attitude of let's avoid interventions that we don't know the outcome of when we get started, that we don't have an exit strategy for. I wouldn't say they followed that rule 100%, right? He plunges deeper into Afghanistan right off the bat, even though we know now he had huge reservations about this behind the scenes, right? But he or more than doubles American forces in Afghanistan. He intervenes in Libya, right? And then later says that was the biggest mistake of his career. All of these were hard choices. But in general, this idea of avoiding large American military commitments on the ground is at least a motive of his, I think very imperfectly executed. And the second one, the rules-based international order, is it's how I think Obama sees the world as someone with a constitutional law background, right? I mean, he and someone who has a very rationalist perspective on things. He does understand that American power is in relative decline to the rest of the world. He wants to ideally bring as many countries into these institutions, alliances, and trade deals as he can, right? So he pursues the Trans-Pacific Partnership to try to strengthen Trans-Pacific trade relations. But he sees his job as restoring American credibility and restoring America as a reliable partner who actually listens to other countries and doesn't just shoot from the hip, as another response to George Bush. So I always think about the Iranian nuclear deal, right? One of his chief foreign policy accomplishments is really premised on the idea that working with our allies, right, working patiently, using diplomacy and economic sanctions, so non-military tools, we can avoid a war with someone like Iran. We can prevent Israel from attacking Iran, which now we're there, right? And get this country to commit to a deal that's the first step towards healing relations, right? And maybe you actually can integrate Iran into the region in a more positive way, right? So anyway, that's I think his overall approach.
Yeah, so from my perspective,
Yeah,
the Obama era foreign policy looks like it contains a kind of a contradiction.
yeah,
Where, on the one hand, like you say, he wants to retreat from George Bush's unilateralism. He doesn't want to have these, we're not going to invade some new country and put 100,000 boots on the ground. So he wants to retreat from that unilateralism, but he doesn't really want to give up the privilege, right? He
yeah.
doesn't, to take a very famous example, we kill Osama bin Laden in Pakistan without telling the Pakistanis about it. And maybe that was a good idea, but you can see that as an exercise of just totally unilateral American power, right? Not going through any form of international law or any form of even negotiation with the state in which we're conducting military operations. And we continue to conduct, the global war on terror in a lot of
Mhm.
ways. The drone program continues under him. We're just assassinating people around the world. Um, and so to me, it seems like he's trying to return us again to this institutionalism that we had in the 90s without actually binding America to the institutions.
Yeah, that's the whole question: is binding. Will the most powerful country in a system bind itself to that system? So this is the classic realist critique, and in some cases, sort of like a progressive left wing critique of the idea of a rules based international order. Is that ultimately America, when it has to, will do what it decides is right for itself. So we'll go with the terrorism example, which I think is a great example that you brought up. I'm actually a little bit of an apologist for the Obama administration on this. I think that their approach to counterterrorism was extremely effective and justifiable under international law, right? So, someone who is a hostile actor against the United States, it doesn't actually matter if they're hanging out in a different country, especially when that country can't or won't go after that person.
Hmm.
So, this is at least the argument that the Obama lawyers put forth. I happen to find it to be a convincing argument. I do happen to find it to be convincing. Where I think the Obama administration could have done better is if you want to say rules-based international order is the central, aspect of American foreign policy, well, then you should build some rules about these things, right? So they built very rigorous. I worked with a bunch of drone pilots who were involved in this at the War College, and of what they could describe to me, the rules that they built, the procedures they built for who can we hit with a drone strike and where and why, what's the acceptable civilian risk, were extremely rigorous. And when you look at the civilian casualties of the drone strike conflict, it's actually pretty low. New America Foundation does great research on this, and it's I'm not trying to dismiss those casualties, right? But it's not thousands and thousands of people, right? However, if you were another country, right, if you're Pakistan, for example, very problematic country in its own right, or if you're China, well, then it seems like America is accepting itself from the rules, in part because they don't know what the rules are, right? A key point about terrorism as a transnational threat is it's taking advantages of these sort of seams and gaps in an international system that's designed to deal with states, the chessboard. And so I think the United States in the war on terror, both under Bush and Obama, missed a lot of opportunities to try to build an international consensus of what is terrorism, what are states' responsibilities towards it, and when can I go after someone in your country? We did this really, really well in the 80s and 90s with things like hijacking and the protection of diplomats. And we signed tons of treaties in the 80s and 90s. It was a bipartisan effort, right, with particularly with our European allies, but really all over the world. And it helped deal with the hijacking problem, which was a huge problem in the 70s and 80s. It helped deal with it extremely effectively because it created responsibilities that countries had for airport security. The war on terror, if we had gone in a different direction, I think there were opportunities to do that, right? And I think Obama, for whatever reason, simply didn't pursue those as actively as he should have.
Yeah, we had rules, but we wrote the rules and only published them internally, right?
Yeah,
And I,
exactly. Yeah,
yeah, other countries are like, well, can I do that, right? Can I go out and
yeah,
drone strike somebody in another country? So okay, um, I guess my next question is to kind of bring us back to where we started,
sure.
in the sense that the order Obama was trying to put together, is not working, is falling apart. And I guess my question is, do you think that's true? And if so, why?
Oh, you mean at the end of sort of like in the 2010s
I mean, now.
or now?
Um,
It so it is weakening at some levels and not weakening at other levels. Hey, there's my cat again. you know, one of the useful things about working at the Naval War College, where I worked for 3 years, is excuse me, Flo. Sorry, she's trying to get her butt in the
yeah,
camera.
she's conducting a
Yeah,
unilateral intervention on the
yeah,
podcast, but cats
yeah.
just have that right under
Hey, they do
international law.
actually. They totally do. So anyway, so working at the Naval War College gave me a really good sense of how America's international presence operates on the medium to low levels. Right. So our embassies, our combatant commands, our international governmental organizations, like there's so much American influence and resources that's being purveyed through these things all over the world at all times. Right. For example, some of my best students are foreign service officers who travel all around the world. They work in embassies, and they're just maintaining these relationships at the ground level, right? So on that level, there's the international system is always kind of being maintained by these worker bees, right? Who are really admirable people who just fly under the radar, career civil servants, admirable, smart people. But then if you kind of go up to the higher political level, absolutely, it's in crisis. I think when Trump stomps on certain norms, you actually start to think about what were those norms in the first place. You realize, oh, I didn't even know that was a norm. I didn't even know that was a thing that people could stomp on. So, this idea, for example, that we should favor relationships with democratic nations instead of autocratic nations is something I don't think Trump believes in. Because of his personality, because of his worldview, and for other reasons that I'm not sure if I really fully understand. All right. But there's a strong evidence that he's reorienting American foreign policy away from our democratic alliances and towards authoritarians. Right. So, who has he intervened to help? Jair Bolsonaro, right? Who he sees as an ally and sort of a blood brother. He absolutely loves Viktor Orban, as you guys have described in many, many great articles on liberal currents and elsewhere. He has begrudging respect for Putin because of Putin's decisiveness and what he sees as Putin's brilliance, even though Putin has just killed 500,000 Russians for no good reason. Uh, so when so there's two things to say here. I mean, one is that he weakens these institutions and he weakens these alliances, but he's also undermined our ability to do that kind of lower level work, right? The worker bee. I don't mean to say that worker bee in a disparaging way, right? But the worker bee maintenance of the rules and of the relationships, by gutting the State Department, destroying USAID, basically trying to destroy the federal civil service, it means that these relationships aren't being maintained the way they once were. And I know this from the news. I know this from my own students telling me this, right? And they're just saying we can't do what we used to do in Poland or Nigeria the way we did 5 years ago.
Okay, so I guess my question here is if this kind of international order, it's not, it hasn't exploded, it hasn't caught on fire, but like the foundations are under attack in certain ways.
Yeah.
And there are, I think a lot of people clearly perceive that this is an opportunity to put forward a new conception of
Mhm.
the world order. And I was wondering if you, like, what do you think are the major new
Hmm.
conceptions that are out there, fighting it out to be the future?
Yeah, great question. Uh, I would say there's a lot. I'll try to categorize them into three. I'll start with
Okay.
the one that I want. So the one that I want is for the United States to recommit to international law, international institutions, and alliance systems, right? So to build not necessarily a containing coalition against China, because I don't think we need containment against China, right? But to strengthen relationships with these emerging and emerged economies in Southeast Asia, to at least create military interoperability to some extent, but also just to build up these countries' own ability to resist China, and to do something very similar for countries kind of in the arc of Russia, right, in around Iran. Um, so what I would like to see is the United States recommit to working in these institutions and alliances and norms, and genuinely restrain itself and genuinely be willing to punish bad actors. So for me, first, let's put it this way: we're doing that in Ukraine. That's example number one of how we're doing that. We're failing to do that in Israel and Gaza, right? Failing. We're absolutely discrediting the idea of a rules-based international order
Yes.
with our behavior, and that's the worst part of what's going on there now is the human suffering. But the second worst part is it's kind of a joke to say that we will support a liberal international order when we are still imposing zero costs on Benjamin Netanyahu for what he's doing, right? Which is in violation of international law in so many ways you can't even count. So that would be so. For example, what I would want is, yeah, you need to punish this actor. It's easier said than done. There's political reasons why that hasn't been done, right? But it really discredits the role of the United States in the world that I would like to see us play. So I can go into the other two if you want, but also I can.
No, no. Let's
Yeah,
get the overview. What are the other
yeah, okay.
two?
Well, the other two are basically the Trumpian unilateralist, anti-institutionalist approach, where the United States doesn't really build anything around the world. It doesn't create any new institutions. It weakens the institutions that exist. Uh, it kind of does whatever the hell it wants. Like I always think about the Qasem Soleimani um, assassination in 2019, which is based on a very BS reading of the 2002 authorization to use force, and was just completely reckless, right? Um, and in which, because the Trump administration or this approach to international relations never tries to solve any problems preemptively, right? It doesn't try to deal with climate change and migration, all it can do, or the Iranian nuclear program or whatever. It just ends up stomping out fires with force when they pop up, right? So when Trump fires the missiles at Iran, it's a totally strategically incoherent decision, and it doesn't solve anything. They're just going to build it again. It just gives countries all the more reason to pursue nuclear weapons. So anyway, the Trumpian vision is about realigning the United States away from our more liberal democratic allies around the world and towards the authoritarians. Right, towards it's a much more of a right wing internationale than you could call it the right wing internationale if you want a phrase for it. And then the third one that I've seen out there is a kind of an acknowledgement of multipolarity and almost like a neospheres of influence kind of thinking, right? So I've always like to say, and I wrote this in the article I wrote for you guys, like multipolarity is coming. There's no doubt about that. Like we're never going to recreate the 1990s unipolar moment. But there's a decent amount of thinkers out there who want the United States to kind of acknowledge, China is going to probably dominate the Asia Pacific. Russia's, well, it's a different case, but it's probably going to try to dominate its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, even though it's a vastly weak, sphere of influence. Even though it's a vastly weaker country than China, vastly, right? Its social problems are so deep, and that's a side issue. In this attitude, the Middle East kind of has to figure itself out. India will probably flex its muscles more. And then in Africa, you'll have new countries like Nigeria, not new, but growing countries like Nigeria that will also probably start flexing their muscles. So in this vision, there's not quite a full-on retreat of the United States from the world, right? But this idea of the United States shouldn't be trying to balance in China or balance in Russia or balance hardly anywhere, because that just gets us into trouble. So some people go really far with this. I think some people, I won't name names, but I think see the United States as the only problem in the international system and really like want this reassertion of Russian and Chinese power so that America will just quit and, and kind of go home. I think that's completely counterproductive and totally unfair to our friends and allies around the system, around the world, and will eventually bite us in the butt in a lot of ways. So anyway, there's definitely more visions of international order out there at the moment, but those are three that I've kind of seen.
Yeah, so I think your point about the Trumpian picture of the world being reactive and incoherent is really important.
Yeah.
Right, that off like in some ways you can see them as like reverting to the conservative mean of being isolationists. Right, they don't want to be part of international institutions. They don't want to, be involved in foreign entanglements. But fundamentally, we live in an interconnected world.
Yeah.
Right, we live in a world of incredibly densely interconnected trade networks. We live in a world like you talked about earlier, where climate change and migration and very like nuclear weapons programs are all just inherently going to tie us all together. And so there's this image of like we're going to retreat from the world, but then we're going to conduct all of these unilateral interventions whenever something pops up and pulls us back into the world. And like fundamentally, I think this is kind of an aimless, perspective on world affairs. Um,
Yeah.
on the other hand, there's what you described as the right wing internationale, which is not an isolationist perspective at all,
Mm.
right? But that is a recognition like, oh, I'm an authoritarian in my country, and you're an authoritarian in your country. And like, we have an alignment ideologically, we have an alignment in terms of our interests in changing the world system. And I think that this is, I mean, like you said, that, Trump's intervention on behalf of Bolsonaro is a good example of this. Um, I think we can see it in the ways, for example, that like Iran, Russia, and China have tied themselves together. And these are
Yeah.
countries that are fundamentally different politically. One of them is an Islamic theocracy. One of them is still a communist authoritarian state, and one of them is like a, what we would call a competitive autocracy, or an illiberal democracy, right? They have elections in Russia, but you always get the same
Yeah.
guy,
They're
blah blah blah. Right, and that is like kind of like based on like this Russian nationalist revanchism, return to traditional values, and so like ideologically they're very different. But they recognize that they are all authoritarians in certain important ways, and that they all have a kind of a common ideological alignment. And I think that you described what your preferred vision was, which is basically the left wing, we're not left wing, but like the democratic, the liberal antithesis of that,
Yeah.
right? Recognizing, okay, well, our interests are primarily aligned with liberal countries and like the idea of liberalism, whether or not we've been traditionally allied with them. The case of Israel being a good example,
Yeah.
um, where it's like, yeah, we've been allied with these people for a long time, but they are pursuing, I think, pretty plainly illiberal policies, causing mass suffering, no regard for human rights or just human life. Um, so, to me, how to put this? Kind of rambling here, but
Yeah.
to me, the most instructive historical comparison is the period between World War One and World War Two, the
Mm-hmm.
interwar period, where you had ideological movements, fascism and communism most especially, that were kind of fighting it out within countries around the world. Right, that the dividing lines in the interwar period didn't run between countries, but ran straight through countries.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the communists, they understood that they had an international cause, and the fascists kind of understood that they had an international cause, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's like reasons that like the Italians and the Germans like kind of got on despite like that, because they were both fascists, right? The ways they intervene in the Spanish Civil War, I think, are also instructive here. And so, do you think that this is an accurate description of where we're going? A kind of a global ideological struggle between the forces of liberalism and the forces of authoritarianism, but where the dividing lines of the struggle don't necessarily run along the borders of states, but straight through different states.
Yes, I think that's a really good way of thinking about it because each of these struggles is going on in any given country. Most of my frame of reference is Western countries, but you can see it in Israel. You can see it in Brazil. I would guess describes a Western country. But you see it in India, for example, right? The BJP nationalism. I'm always a little skeptical of really, really big meta narratives, right? There's always complexity.
Hmm.
It's interesting to think. I would like to know more about how do African nations see this idea of an liberal international order, right? Do they just see it as like cover for American power? Do they see it as neo-imperialism? I mean, I've seen evidence of that being the case. Sorry, could you rephrase? Could you go back to your original question?
Yeah, yeah.
I took
I guess.
myself somewhere else on that. Yeah.
I mean, I guess my question was like, regardless of how Trump may or may not try to guide foreign like American policy, do you think that this framing of like, yeah, we are once again in an era of ideological struggle, a global ideological struggle between different conceptions of human
Yeah.
society, is do you think that that's an accurate description of where we're going?
Yes, but it's going to be really, really confusing because America will change sides constantly. So, we literally just change sides in this conflict. And, in the Cold War, we had this consensus around containing the Soviet Union, right, and strengthening alliances with democracies. Again, not consistently enforced. Worked with plenty of autocracies during the Cold War. Um, but there was way more continuity between administrations because I think ultimately the political spectrum was narrower in that time period, right? And I think the political spectrum has widened, and particularly on the right, it has widened way, way further out. But the conditions for a reaction against globalization, a reaction against, to some extent, against neoliberal economics, and a reaction against immigration and demographic change and cultural change, with like LGBT issues, for example, those conditions are in place all over the world, right? And you see these dynamics be replicated between people who feel like they're losing from these changes and people who feel like they're winning from these changes or who embrace and reject. And so that means that that's definitely going to play out in people's attitudes towards the international system. And I think my favorite parallel to the interwar period, which you brought up, which I think is a great analogy, is what Tim Snyder describes this in his book Black Earth. He talks about a key difference between kind of going authoritarian and staying democratic is how do you react to interdependence, right? So the rise of fascism and communism was in large part, I think especially fascism, in large part of rejection or a reaction of the first stage of globalization, right, which is pre-World War I, where you had a huge increase in international trade, in the movement of populations and immigration, and so on, that broke down what many people felt were these essential national units or races, and so on, right? And so there's tremendous anxiety going on about what interdependence meant. You know, it's interesting that both communist and fascist nations in the interwar period were autarkic economically. They wanted socialism in one country, or Hitler's giant empire that would only interact with itself. So it was a total rejection of interdependence on a cultural level that played out on a geopolitical level. And what made FDR such an important figure is that he restored the credibility of the idea of interdependence among Americans, right? The idea that we benefit from and have responsibilities to form relationships and tie ourselves to other nations. And there are always costs to that, but I think he showed the benefits are greater.
Yeah, so I think, these days you'll occasionally people toss or see people toss around this phrase, the new Cold War or Cold
Yep.
War II. I think there's something to that, but I think it's misleading in certain ways that you've kind of gestured at. Where during the Cold War, we knew where the poles were, right? There was Washington and there was Moscow, and we knew what each one of them stood for very clearly and like what they were trying to do in the world. And those are like kind of like fixed points in the international system.
Yeah.
Um, right. And so like you said, whereas what we're looking at today is a situation where, like, who knows what is going to happen in the United States, right? In the next
Mm-hmm.
4 years, in the next 8 years, are we going to switch sides yet again? And I think that more approximates the chaos of the interwar period, where there was
Yeah.
this sense that states, even the big states, the very important states, were all up for grabs. Right, that you had these coherent ideological formations inside of these states just kind of like wrestling with each other. um, do you think that this is going to, or do you think that this should reframe how we think about foreign policy? To go back to your metaphor, like to go from the chessboard to the network, do you think that's how we should be seeing things?
I think you have to deal with both. I think the great weakness of the current Trump administration is the total neglect of the. Sorry, her metaphor was the web and the chessboard. Not, I messed it up. It wasn't the network. Yeah, I think the Trump administration generally neglects the kind of web transnational issues because they really just want to seal the United States off from these issues, right? So there's no, for example, in migration, there's no thinking of how do we deal with root causes of migration, right? It's just Bukele crack down on everybody,
Hmm.
prevent migrants from leaving, crush any
Yeah,
kind of.
build the wall, build the camps, send out the secret police.
Exactly. I mean, ultimately, you have to deal with both. Nation states are still really important, and they might be more important now in an age of resurgent nationalism than they were 25 years ago. Um, I think that there's a mood around the world about reasserting sovereignty and reasserting what a nation is. So, like when you read J.D. Vance's Claremont speech, you know, I know it's horrible. It's intellectual chicanery, but he is tapping into a lot of American sense of what does it mean to be American? What is our nation, right? And when you have, historically, this is a morally neutral statement, right? But historically, when you have high levels of immigration, when people feel like that's not controlled, and when that's combined with a sense of cultural change, people start to say, well, who are we really, right? Um, and JD's whole argument is, well, we're not just a set of ideas. We're not just an experiment. That's too abstract for a lot of people. That's extremely powerful to me. I think that's what defines being an American, right? But there's people like JD all around the world saying, well, no, we're defined by
Our
a
blood and
set,
our soil.
our blood and our soil, or a set of cultural practices, right? And I am hoping that the America, that's obviously true of the United States, right? We Almost everyone in America loves football, right? Football is not a value. it's not an experiment. It's a game. It's a sport, right? There's plenty of cultural practices that unite Americans across these, the
Ethnic,
boundaries
racial, religious,
exactly
well,
that they're
and
so concerned about, right? But there's no doubt that when he gets up and gives that kind of speech, it's appealing to a wide range of people. So anyway, I'm really interested in the foreign policy consequences of that attitude, right? Because I think it plays out in a sense of like, well, Viktor Orban is our friend because he's crushing the liberals too, and Emmanuel Macron is not, right? Or Olaf Scholz is not because he's, well, take Germany. They're trying to marginalize the Alternative for Deutschland party, right? So anyway,
yeah. I mean, I think this is ultimately, I don't know, could talk for another hour, but we have to end
for
somewhere.
sure.
And this question of who are we, I think, is going to be a defining question for Americans, both domestically and around the world. Who are we, and what do we stand for in this increasingly uncertain world?
Yeah. Can I add
So,
one other quick
yeah,
thing?
yeah, shoot.
I think we often go back to the Cold War and we say, well, wasn't it great that we're all on the same page, right? Um, and we had a political system in which Democrats and Republicans are not as far apart as they are right now, and that played out in foreign policy and this famous phrase that politics stops at the water's edge, which is never really true. But what I always kind of think is the maintenance of that consensus in American politics and foreign policy required keeping certain people out of the conversation, right? Uh, I wrote about this in my article for you guys, right? Having an establishment is all about gatekeeping. And in my article, I said we should be keeping the kooks and racists and insane people out. But our political and foreign policy establishment in that seemingly golden age was, extremely monolithic. Right? It did not include women. It did not include LGBT people. It did not include non-white people for the most part. Right? So I think, in a really broad sense, when Americans ask the question, "Who are we?" and um, how does this play out in foreign policy? We're dealing with a necessary political, social, cultural change where these people actually get a say in who America is. Whereas before, they were just shut out.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. There
Yeah,
are real changes happening in our world, right? There, and it's just a question of like, how are we going to incorporate these new voices in our political system?
yeah,
So yeah, thanks so much for coming on, and it was a great conversation.
of course. Thank you so much.